The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the mountains when Harold Thompson carefully tied his worn leather shoes. At 93 years old, every movement was deliberate, but his hands remained steady, a reminder of his years of military discipline. He adjusted his navy blue veteran's cap in the mirror, making sure the Korean War pin was clearly visible. It wasn't vanity, it was pride. The walk to Sally's Diner was exactly 4 blocks from his small house on Maple Street. Harold had measured it countless times over the past 30 years, using his cane to count the cracks in the sidewalk. Every morning, rain or shine, summer or winter, he would leave his house at exactly 7:15 a.m. The neighbors could set their watches by his departure. Today was no different. As Harold made his way down the street, he stopped briefly to wave at Mrs. Peterson, who was already tending to her rose garden. Her husband had been a Navy man, and they shared that unspoken bond of military service. 3 houses down, young Tommy Jenkins rode past on his bicycle, ringing his bell twice, their special morning greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Tommy called out, circling back on his bike. "Did you watch the baseball game last night?" Harold smiled, his weathered face crinkling around the eyes. "Sure did, Tommy. Those Diamondbacks sure gave us a good show." He didn't mention that he had fallen asleep by the 7th inning, as he usually did these days. The familiar red and chrome sign of Sally's Diner came into view as Harold turned the corner. The morning sun made the recently cleaned windows sparkle, and he could already smell the fresh coffee brewing inside. The bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open at exactly 7:30 a.m. "There's our favorite Marine," called out Betty, the head waitress who had been serving Harold his breakfast for the past 15 years. She was already moving towards the coffee pot, knowing his order by heart. "The usual, Harold." The old veteran made his way to his corner booth, the leather seat worn smooth from years of use. "You know me too well, Betty," he replied, carefully placing his cane against the wall and sliding into his spot. The booth gave him a clear view of both the entrance and the street outside, old habits from his military days that he never quite shook. Betty brought over his black coffee and a glass of ice water, both arriving just as Harold finished arranging his napkin on his lap. The routine was comfortable, like a well-worn pair of shoes. "Your toast will be up in exactly 3 minutes," she said with a wink. The morning regulars began filtering in, each stopping by Harold's booth to say hello. There was Dave, the local high school principal, who always asked Harold to speak at the school's Veterans Day assembly. Sarah, the postal worker, would wave from her booth while sorting through her morning route paperwork. And George, the retired mechanic, would slide in across from Harold for exactly 7 minutes each morning to share the latest town gossip. "Did you hear about the new motorcycle shop opening up on 5th Street?" George asked, settling into his usual spot. "Might bring some new faces to town." Harold nodded, carefully buttering his whole wheat toast that had arrived exactly as Betty promised. He liked how the diner struck the perfect balance between crispy and soft, just the way he had enjoyed it since his days in the service. "Change is part of life, George. As long as they respect our little town, we'll respect them." The morning sun streamed through the large windows, creating warm patches on the red and white checkered tablecloth. Harold could see his reflection in the chrome napkin holder, an old man, yes, the one who still sat with military posture, whose eyes still held the sharp alertness of a Marine Corps drill instructor. As he sipped his coffee, Harold thought about how this diner had become more than just a breakfast spot. It was his anchor to the community, a place where memories of his late wife didn't sting quite so much, where he could feel connected to the world despite his advancing age. Each morning ritual, from adjusting his cap to arranging his silverware just so, was a small victory against time, a declaration that he was still very much part of life's ongoing story. Little did Harold know that this peaceful morning routine, maintained faithfully for 3 decades, was about to face an unexpected challenge. But then again, Marines are trained to handle the unexpected, and Harold Thompson was, above all else, a Marine. The peace of Harold's morning routine was shattered one Tuesday in early October. The rumbling started as a distant thunder, growing louder until the diner's windows began to vibrate. 5 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome pipes gleaming in the morning sun. The riders, dressed in black leather jackets covered in patches, dismounted their bikes with the confidence of men who were used to commanding attention. Betty's hand trembled slightly as she refilled Harold's coffee cup. "Never seen those types around here before," she whispered, watching as the bikers approached the entrance. The bell above the door chimed 5 times in quick succession as they entered, bringing with them the smell of leather and exhaust fumes. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, scanned the diner before his eyes settled on Harold's corner booth. Without hesitation, he strode over, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor. The other 4 bikers followed, forming an intimidating wall of leather and denim. "Nice spot you got here, old-timer," the leader said, his voice gruff and loud enough for everyone to hear. "But my boys and I need a booth, and this one's got the best view." He gestured toward the window with a gloved hand. Harold looked up from his toast, his blue eyes meeting the biker's dark ones. For a moment, the diner was silent except for the quiet hiss of the coffee maker. Then, with deliberate movements, Harold gathered his cane and coffee cup. "The booth is all yours," he said quietly, his military training evident in his controlled response. As Harold moved to the counter, he could hear the bikers laughing and making themselves comfortable in his booth. They sprawled across the seats, their leather jackets creaking as they settled in. Betty hurried over with menus, her usual cheerful greeting replaced with nervous efficiency. "Look at this place," one of the bikers said loudly. "It's like stepping into a time machine." "Hey, that includes the customers too." More laughter followed, and Harold could feel their eyes on his back. The regular customers began to react to the change. Dave, the school principal, finished his breakfast in record time and left with just a quick nod to Harold. Sarah, the postal worker, chose a table far from the biker's booth. Even George, who never missed his 7-minute morning chat, took one look through the window and decided to keep walking. Over the next hour, the bikers made themselves at home. They ordered large breakfasts, talked loudly about their travels, and made comments about the sleepy little town they found themselves in. Their presence seemed to fill the entire diner, pushing against the walls like an expanding bubble. Harold sat at the counter, his back straight as ever, methodically finishing his breakfast. He noticed how Betty's hands shook slightly as she served the bikers, how the cook peeked nervously through the kitchen window, how the few remaining regular customers hunched over their plates, trying to become invisible. The next morning, Harold arrived at his usual time, hoping things would return to normal. But the motorcycles were already there, their engines still ticking as they cooled in the morning air. His booth was occupied again, the bikers having apparently decided to make Sally's Diner their new morning hangout. Days turned into weeks, and a new routine established itself. Harold would arrive at 7:30 a.m., find his booth taken, and quietly settle at the counter. The bikers, led by the man they called Snake, would hold court in the corner, their presence growing more dominating with each passing day. The diner's atmosphere changed. The morning chatter was replaced by the bikers' loud conversations and occasional bursts of rough laughter. Regular customers started finding other places for breakfast. Betty's cheerful greetings became subdued, her smile forced. Even the sunshine streaming through the windows seemed different, casting shadows where there used to be light. But Harold kept coming. Every morning, he would walk those 4 blocks, enter at exactly 7:30 a.m., and take his place at the counter. His military training had taught him about strategic patience, about choosing your moments. And so he waited, watching as his beloved morning sanctuary slowly transformed into something unrecognizable, knowing that sooner or later, something would have to give. What the bikers didn't realize was that beneath Harold's quiet exterior, a plan was forming. After all, you don't survive a war and spend decades as a Marine Corps drill instructor without learning a thing or two about handling difficult situations. By the 3rd week of the bikers' presence at Sally's Diner, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Snake, the leader of the group, had taken to watching Harold every morning with a mix of amusement and growing irritation. The old veteran's quiet dignity seemed to bother him more each day. "Hey, Grandpa," Snake called out one morning as Harold took his usual spot at the counter. "Don't your bones get tired of dragging yourself here every day?" His fellow bikers snickered, the sound echoing off the diner's walls. Harold kept his eyes on his coffee cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip. His silence only seemed to annoy Snake more. "I'm talking to you, old-timer," Snake said, his voice getting louder. "What's the matter? Hearing aid batteries run out." Betty, who was wiping down nearby tables, dropped her cleaning rag. "Now that's enough," she said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "Mr. Thompson is a respected customer here." Snake turned his attention to Betty, his eyes narrowing. "Respected. Lady, respect is earned where I come from. All I see is an old man taking up space." The other customers in the diner quickly paid their bills and left, leaving their half-eaten breakfasts behind. The cook, Mike, watched nervously through the kitchen window, his spatula gripped tightly in his hand. Harold continued eating his toast, maintaining his military precision in each movement. He cut each piece into 4 equal squares, just as he had done every morning for 30 years. His hands remained steady, even as the bikers' laughter grew louder. "Look at him," one of the younger bikers said, pointing at Harold's methodical eating habits. "He's like one of those wind-up toys. Bet if we knock him over, he'll just keep going through the motions." Snake stood up from the booth, his leather jacket creaking as he stretched to his full height. He walked over to the counter, deliberately bumping Harold's elbow as he reached for the sugar dispenser. Harold's fork clattered against his plate, but he caught it before it could fall to the floor. "Still got some reflexes left, huh?" Snake smirked. "Wonder what else the old Marine can do." For the first time that morning, Harold turned his head slightly to look at Snake. His blue eyes, sharp despite his age, met Snake's gaze for just a moment before returning to his breakfast. This subtle acknowledgement seemed to fuel Snake's determination to get a reaction. Over the next few days, the harassment escalated. The bikers would move Harold's cane when he wasn't looking, forcing him to search for it. They would deliberately bump his seat at the counter, trying to make him spill his coffee. They even started timing their arrivals to coincide exactly with Harold's, making a show of taking up all the counter spaces near his usual spot. Betty tried her best to protect Harold, but there was only so much she could do. She started serving him his coffee in a to-go cup with a lid, hoping to prevent spills when the bikers jostled him. Mike, the cook, began preparing Harold's toast extra quickly, trying to minimize the time the veteran had to spend in the increasingly hostile environment. The diner's regular customers had dwindled to almost none. The morning rush, once filled with friendly chatter and the clink of coffee cups, was replaced by the sound of motorcycle boots on linoleum and rough laughter. The warmth that had made Sally's diner special was fading away. Through it all, Harold maintained his routine. He arrived at 7:30 a.m. sharp, ordered the same breakfast, and ate with the same careful precision. But those who knew him well could see small changes. His shoulders were a bit more tense, his jaw a bit more set. The light in his eyes, usually bright with friendly recognition, had taken on a steely glint. One morning, as Harold watched Snake and his crew through the reflection in the napkin holder, something shifted in his expression. Betty, who had known Harold for 15 years, recognized that look. It was the same look her father, also a Marine, would get when he'd had enough of something. The next day would mark 1 month since the bikers had first arrived at Sally's diner, and unknown to Snake and his crew, it would also mark the day when a 93-year-old veteran would remind them of an important lesson about respect, service, and the mistake of underestimating the Marine Corps drill instructor. The morning started like any other, with Harold Thompson adjusting his Korean War veteran's cap in front of his hallway mirror. But something was different in his eyes today, a familiar fire that hadn't burned since his days as a Marine Corps drill instructor. He grabbed his cane and began his walk to Sally's diner, his steps more purposeful than usual. The rumble of motorcycles already filled the morning air when Harold arrived at the diner. Snake and his crew had made sure to arrive early again, spreading themselves across multiple seats at the counter. Only one stool remained empty, wobbling slightly on a loose base, a trap they had specifically set up for the old veteran. Betty saw Harold approaching through the window and quickly wiped away tears of frustration. Over the past month, she had watched helplessly as these bikers had systematically destroyed the peaceful atmosphere of her diner. She started preparing Harold's usual coffee, her hands shaking slightly. The bell chimed as Harold entered. Snake immediately nudged one of his crew members, grinning. "Watch this," he whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. As Harold made his way to the only available stool, Snake stuck out his boot just slightly. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Harold's cane caught on Snake's boot, causing him to stumble forward. His coffee cup, which Betty had just placed on the counter, tipped over, sending hot liquid streaming across the surface. But instead of falling, Harold caught himself with a grace that surprised everyone, including Snake. For a moment, the diner was completely silent. The only sound was the dripping of coffee onto the floor. Harold slowly straightened himself up to his full height, his back military straight despite his 93 years. His blue eyes, usually gentle, had turned to steel. "A month," Harold said, his voice clear and commanding. It was not the wavering voice of an elderly man, but the sharp tone of someone used to being obeyed. "For a month, I've watched you boys play your games." Snake started to smirk, but something in Harold's expression made him pause. The old veteran wasn't looking at them with fear or anger. He was looking at them with disappointment, the way a teacher might look at misbehaving students. "You wear those leather jackets like they make you tough," Harold continued, his voice getting stronger with each word. "You swagger around, thinking that intimidation makes you men. But let me tell you something about real tough men." Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. His movements were deliberate, practiced, the movements of someone who had spent decades maintaining discipline. "Real tough men," he said, "don't need to prove anything to anyone. Real tough men build things up, not tear them down. And real tough men," he paused, looking directly at Snake, "respect their elders, especially those who helped train their fathers." The diner had grown so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Even the sizzling from the kitchen had stopped as Mike, the cook, leaned through his window to listen. 30 years ago, Harold's voice took on a different tone, one filled with memory. "I had a young Marine in my training unit. Scared kid from Arizona, but he had heart. James Snake Eyes Martinez was his name. Couldn't shoot straight to save his life at first, but by the time I was done with him, he was one of the best marksmen in his class." Snake's face had gone pale. His real name was Michael Martinez, and James Snake Eyes Martinez was his father's name, a fact he hadn't shared with anyone in his crew. "Your father," Harold continued, now speaking directly to Snake, "was one of the finest Marines I ever trained. He wrote to me every Christmas until he passed, telling me about his family, about his son Michael, who he hoped would grow up to be a man of honor." Snake stood up slowly, his tough guy facade crumbling. "How did you?" he started to ask, but his voice trailed off as Harold reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded photograph. The photo showed a younger Harold in drill instructor uniform, standing next to a group of Marines. In the front row, grinning proudly, was a young man who looked remarkably like Snake, down to the same determined jaw and bright eyes. The other bikers watched in stunned silence as their leader's entire demeanor changed. The moment had come when everything would change at Sally's diner, all because a 93-year-old veteran had finally had enough. Snake's hands trembled as he held the faded photograph. His tough exterior had cracked, revealing the uncertain young man beneath. The other bikers gathered around, looking over his shoulder at the image of a young James Martinez, standing proud in his Marine uniform. Harold remained standing, his posture perfect despite his age. "Your father," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "was more than just another recruit to me. He was part of what we called the Impossible Squad. 12 young men that nobody thought would make it through basic training." Eddie quietly brought Harold a fresh cup of coffee, and the old veteran took a careful sip before continuing. The entire diner was captivated by his words, including the few regular customers who had braved coming in that morning. "James Martinez," Harold said, pointing to the young man in the photo, "couldn't hit a target to save his life when he first arrived. His hands shook so bad, the other drill instructors wanted to wash him out in the first week." A small smile crossed Harold's weathered face, but I saw something in his eyes, the same determination I see in yours, Michael. Snake's head snapped up at the sound of his real name. His fellow bikers exchanged surprised looks. They had never known him as anything but Snake. "How did you know?" Snake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know who I was as soon as I walked in?" Harold reached into his wallet again and pulled out another photograph, this one newer but still worn around the edges. "Your father sent me this 15 years ago. It's you at your high school graduation." He handed the photo to Snake. He was so proud that day. Wrote me a 3-page letter about how his son was growing into a fine young man. The other bikers watched in amazement as their tough leader's eyes filled with tears. Snake stared at the graduation photo, recognizing the moment his father had taken it, one of the last happy memories before his dad's illness took him. "For 23 years, Harold continued, his voice growing stronger, I trained over 3,000 Marines. Each one of them was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's future father. I didn't just teach them how to be Marines, I taught them how to be men of honor." He paused, looking around at each of the bikers. Your father understood that, Michael. He learned that respect isn't taken by force, it's earned through actions. He learned that true strength isn't about intimidation, it's about lifting others up. Snake wiped his eyes with the back of his leather-clad hand. My dad, he used to tell stories about his drill instructor. Said the man was tougher than nails but fair as sunrise. He looked up at Harold with new understanding. He said that instructor saved his life, taught him what it meant to be a real man. That was you. Harold nodded slowly. That was me. And every morning, when I come to this diner, I carry the responsibility of those lessons with me. Every Marine I trained, including your father, became part of my extended family. Which makes you, Michael Martinez, part of that family too. The declaration hung in the air, powerful in its simplicity. Snake looked around the diner, at the coffee stain on the counter, at Betty's tear-streaked face, at his fellow bikers' shocked expressions, and suddenly saw everything through new eyes. Sir, Snake said, standing up straight for the first time since entering the diner a month ago. I've dishonored my father's memory, dishonored everything he learned from you. Harold placed a firm hand on Snake's shoulder. The measure of a man isn't in his mistakes, son, it's in how he corrects them. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the moment affecting even the toughest among them. They had come to this small town looking for trouble, only to find themselves face to face with a living legend, a man who had helped shape the kind of soldier and father that Snake's dad had become. In that moment, as the morning sun streamed through Sally's diner's windows, something profound changed. It wasn't just about a veteran standing up to bullies. It was about the lasting impact of lessons taught, values passed down, and the unexpected ways the past can reach out to touch the present. The atmosphere in Sally's diner had completely changed. Snake carefully placed the graduation photo on the counter and reached inside his leather jacket. He pulled out a worn leather wallet of his own, hands still trembling slightly. Opening it, he removed a folded piece of paper that had clearly been carried for many years. My dad wrote this letter to me before he passed, Snake said, his voice rough with emotion. I've never shown it to anyone, not even my crew. He unfolded the paper carefully, treating it like a precious treasure. He mentioned you in it, sir. I just never knew, never made the connection. Harold sat down at the counter, his cane resting against his leg. Betty quickly brought him a fresh cup of coffee and one for Snake, too. The other bikers remained standing, forming a respectful semicircle around their leader and the veteran. Would you? Snake paused, clearing his throat. Would you like to read it? Harold took the letter with careful hands, the same way he had handled countless important documents during his years of service. His eyes moved slowly across the handwritten words, taking in each line with deliberate attention. My dear son Michael, Harold read aloud, his voice clear and steady. As I write this, I know my time is short. There's so much I want to tell you, so many lessons I need to make sure you remember. The most important ones I learned from a man named Harold Thompson. Snake sank into the counter seat next to Harold, listening intently to his father's words being read in the voice of the man who had helped shape them. The other bikers pulled up chairs, their usual rowdy demeanor replaced by respectful silence. He taught me that strength isn't in your fists, but in your character, Harold continued reading. That respect isn't demanded, it's earned. That the true measure of a man is how he treats those who can't fight back. Betty wiped tears from her eyes as she refilled coffee cups around the counter. Even Mike, the cook, had come out of his kitchen to listen. The morning sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows, but the atmosphere inside had never been brighter. If you ever meet Sergeant Thompson, Harold's voice caught slightly on the words, tell him thank you. Tell him that every good thing I became as a man, I owed to his guidance. Tell him that the lessons he taught us weren't just about being Marines. They were about being human. Snake reached up and wiped his eyes with his bandana. The tough biker image he had cultivated for years seemed to fade away, revealing the son who still missed his father desperately. There's more, Harold said, carefully folding the letter. But I think that's for you to keep private, son. I've been carrying that letter for 5 years, Snake admitted. Read it so many times the paper's starting to wear out, but I never thought I'd meet the man my dad wrote about. Never thought I'd be sitting here, drinking coffee with him. One of the younger bikers, a man with a flaming skull tattoo on his arm, stepped forward. Hey, Snake, I mean Michael. Maybe we should clean up that coffee we spilled earlier. Snake nodded, standing up quickly. Yes, we should. Betty, could you bring us some rags? The transformation was remarkable to watch. The same bikers who had been terrorizing the diner for a month were now carefully wiping down counters, straightening chairs, and apologizing to other customers. Their leather jackets and tattoos remained the same, but their attitudes had undergone a complete change. Harold watched it all with quiet satisfaction, sipping his coffee and sharing more stories about James Martinez with Snake. He pulled out more photos from his wallet. Snake's father leading marching drills, receiving awards, standing proud at his graduation from basic training. Your dad kept in touch more than most, Harold said, showing Snake a stack of Christmas cards. Wrote to me every year, told me about your baseball games, your first motorcycle, your high school graduation. He was so proud of you, son. He just wanted you to find your way to being the man he knew you could be. The morning stretched on, but nobody seemed eager to leave. The regular customers started returning, drawn by the unexpected scene of bikers and veterans sharing coffee and memories. The harsh lines between past and present, between tough guys and tender hearts, had blurred into something new and unexpected at Sally's Diner. Word spread quickly through the small town of Millbrook about what had happened at Sally's Diner. By the next morning, curious onlookers drove by slowly to witness an unexpected sight. 5 motorcycles lined up neatly outside, their chrome sparkling in the sun, with Harold Thompson's regular parking spot left conspicuously empty. When Harold arrived at exactly 7:30 a.m., Snake was waiting outside. The biker leader, now known to everyone by his real name Michael, stood straight and respectful. He had traded his usual ripped t-shirt for a clean black button-up shirt, though he kept his leather jacket. "Good morning, sir," Michael said, opening the diner's door. "Your booth is waiting." Inside, the other bikers had already cleaned and prepared Harold's corner booth. A fresh cup of coffee steamed on the table, and his usual whole wheat toast was being kept warm in the kitchen. Betty watched from behind the counter, smiling at the transformation she was witnessing. "You boys didn't have to do all this," Harold said, but his eyes twinkled with appreciation. "Yes, sir, we did," Michael replied firmly. "My father would have expected nothing less." As Harold settled into his booth, Michael sat across from him, pulling out a small photo album he had brought from home. "I found these last night," he said, opening to the first page. "Pictures of my dad in the Marines. I thought, maybe you'd like to see them." The other bikers gathered around respectfully as Harold examined each photograph. His weathered fingers traced the faces of young Marines he had trained, sharing stories about each one. The diner's regular customers began returning, drawn by the unexpected scene of tough bikers listening intently to an elderly veteran's tales of honor and service. "Your father," Harold said, pointing to a group photo, organized a collection for a local orphanage during Christmas of '75. "Got the whole unit involved. Those kids had the best holiday of their lives." Michael's eyes widened. He used to do the same thing with our motorcycle club, before he got sick. Every Christmas, we'd buy toys for kids in need. I let that tradition die after he passed. One of the younger bikers, Tommy, spoke up. "We could start it again, Michael. Christmas is only a few months away." The suggestion sparked something in Michael's eyes. "Mr. Thompson, would you help us organize it? Like you did with my dad's unit?" Harold smiled, his face crinkling with warmth. "I'd be honored, son." Over the next few hours, the corner booth became a planning center. The bikers pulled out notebooks, making lists and assignments. Their enthusiasm for helping others matched the energy they had once put into intimidation. Other customers began offering suggestions and support, the whole community coming together around this unexpected alliance. Betty kept the coffee flowing, watching in amazement as her diner transformed into something even more special than before. The morning regulars returned one by one, no longer afraid but curious and supportive. Dave, the school principal, even suggested involving his students in the Christmas project. "My dad would have loved this," Michael said quietly to Harold as they reviewed the growing plans. "Seeing everyone come together like this, it's what he always talked about." Harold placed a firm hand on Michael's shoulder. "He's seeing it, son, through you. Through all of this, the bikers began establishing a new routine. Every morning, they would arrive early to prepare Harold's booth, then spend breakfast learning from his stories and working on their community projects. Their motorcycles, once a symbol of intimidation, became familiar sights outside local charity events and community gatherings. The transformation went beyond just activities. The bikers' attitudes and behavior changed noticeably. They started helping elderly customers with their doors, offering to escort people to their cars in bad weather, and even helping Betty clean up after the morning rush. "You know," Harold said one morning, looking around at the now bustling diner, "your father once told me that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a better future." Michael nodded, understanding deep in his eyes. "And that's exactly what we're going to do, sir. One day at a time, just like you taught him." The redemption of Snake and his crew became a story that people in Millbrook would tell for years to come. How a 93-year-old veteran's quiet dignity and unexpected connection had transformed a group of troublemaking bikers into community leaders, all because of lessons taught decades ago to a young Marine named James Martinez. 2 years passed quickly in the town of Millbrook. Sally's Diner remained the heart of the community, but now it was known for something special: the unlikely friendship between a Marine Corps veteran and a group of reformed bikers who had become the town's most dedicated community servants. On a crisp autumn morning, Michael "Snake" Martinez stood in front of Harold Thompson's favorite booth, now empty for the first time in 32 years. His leather jacket was adorned with new patches, not of skull and crossbones, but of various charity organizations and community service awards. "He went peacefully," Betty said softly, placing a cup of black coffee on the table, Harold's usual order. In his sleep, just how he wanted. The diner was full but quiet. Regular customers, bikers, and townspeople had gathered to pay their respects. Above the booth hung a newly installed shadow box containing Harold's Marine Corps drill instructor cover, his Korean War medals, and the faded photograph of him with James Martinez's graduating class. Michael picked up the coffee cup with trembling hands. "The last thing he said to me," he spoke, his voice rough with emotion, "was that he was proud. Proud of what we'd become, proud of how we'd honored my father's memory." The other bikers stood nearby, each wearing clean, pressed clothes under their leather jackets. Over the past 2 years, they had become fixtures in the community. They had organized toy drives, started a mentoring program for troubled youth, and even helped renovate the local Veterans Center, all inspired by Harold's stories about their leader's father. Tommy, the youngest biker, stepped forward with a large envelope. "We received this yesterday," he said. "Harold had his lawyer prepare it before he left us." Michael opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter, written in Harold's precise handwriting, and a stack of photographs spanning decades of military service. "To Michael and the boys," he read aloud, his voice steady despite his tears. "If you're reading this, I've reported for my final deployment. But before I go, I want you to know something important." The diner fell completely silent as Michael continued reading. "In my 30 years as a Marine Corps drill instructor, I trained thousands of young men. But in my last 2 years at Sally's Diner, I got to see something even more remarkable. I got to see those lessons live on through the next generation." Betty brought out fresh coffee for everyone as Michael read on. "Michael, you and your crew reminded me why I spent all those years training Marines. It wasn't just about making soldiers. It was about making men of character. Men like your father. Men like you've become." One of the bikers wiped his eyes with a bandana, not caring who saw. "I'm leaving you boys my collection of Marine Corps photographs and memories. Share them. Learn from them. Add to them with your own stories of service to others. The booth at Sally's Diner isn't just a place to sit. It's a place where legacies live on." The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, catching the metals in the shadow box and making them gleam. Michael stood up, raising Harold's coffee cup in a toast. "To Harold Thompson," he said. "Marine, mentor, friend." "To Harold," the crowd echoed, raising their cups. From that day forward, Sally's Diner became more than just a restaurant. Harold's booth was preserved, but not as a memorial. Instead, it became a place where veterans could eat for free, where troubled youth could find mentoring from Michael and his crew, and where the spirit of service that Harold had championed lived on. The bikers maintained their morning routine, arriving early to help Betty open up, sharing coffee and stories with customers, and continuing the community projects they had started under Harold's guidance. Their motorcycles, once symbols of intimidation, now led charity rides and escorted military funeral processions. On the wall above the booth, next to Harold's shadow box, hung a new plaque with words taken from his final letter. Legacy isn't what we leave behind, it's what lives on through others. And in Millbrook, Harold Thompson's legacy lived on through an unlikely group of bikers who had learned, just as their leader's father had decades before, that true strength comes not from intimidation, but from service to others. Every morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., as the sun streamed through Sally's diner's windows, someone would place a fresh cup of black coffee in Harold's booth, a simple reminder that some stories don't end, they just become part of a greater legacy.